I don't know. Okay. Can you guys, is this good? Am I good to start? Okay. Cool. I'll get started then. Hey, everybody. My name is Glenn. How's it going, guys? What is today? Tuesday? Yeah, Monday. Oh, yeah. It's been a long week. All right. So my name is Glenn. Thanks for coming to this class. I think it's mandatory. It's okay. But bringing AGI to the Department of Defense, is that salacious enough for you guys? I think hopefully I maximized that. Today I'm going to be reflecting on the DoD's Generative AI Task Force and discussing the future, what barriers exist, things like that. And yeah, let's get started, I guess. All right, so the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. We're going to define the problem, DoD and AGI. I know it sounds salacious, but we're going to get into it, don't worry. A retrospective on the DoD's Generative AI Task Force. It's called Task Force Lima. So that was the DoD's Generative AI Task Force. We'll get into that as well. And then we're going to look at the future of what AGI and DoD actually looks like. I can also circulate these slides. These are all for the public record, so you can access them anywhere. And yeah, feel free to ask questions throughout the talk. If I say an acronym that doesn't make any sense, just like let me know, shout it out. And I know this is like an entrepreneur class, right? So as you guys are like, I'm talking through everything. If you identify like these capability gaps, think of those as like entrepreneurship opportunities. Yeah, like something that you could build potentially startup or company around. So again, super informal, chill. So if you have any questions, just let me know. All right, so a little bit about myself. My name is Glenn. I'm the Pentagon's first technical lead for generative AI. I worked for the Secretary of Defense Chief Digital and AI Office as a GS-15. My background, software turned data scientist, turned AI engineer. I led engineering for the Pentagon's, they call us the SWAT team of nerds, which in these circles is a compliment, I know, but it kind of sounds like pejorative. It's called the Defense Digital Service. We're going to get into a couple of different things I've published in terms of LM ops frameworks for the DoD on behalf of the SecDef. My background before that, go Bears. I went to Berkeley, studied data science and CS. I founded one of the student-run organizations here. It's called Political Computer Science. I'm actually giving a talk there later this week. And I built and sold a political tech startup back in 2020. That's what brought me from here in Berkeley over to DC a couple of years back. So disclaimer, like this talk reflects my opinions and experiences. The DoD is really big and diverse. So you're gonna have people who have differing opinions, and like that's totally okay. But yeah, just wanted to preface with that. All right, so I'm just gonna quickly go over my journey with generative AI, if anyone cares. Again, Go Bears, went to Berkeley, studied data science, NLP here. Was super interested in the intersection of politics and using different data science tools, principal component analysis to model polarization in Congress, things like that. But back in like 2019, 2020, began using the different GPT-2 and 3 models, saw immense potential. And if you guys will find out throughout today, I love Ezra Klein. He's one of my favorite podcasters. And there was an interview he did back in 2021 where Sam Altman basically was talking about how they're obviously going to hit performance limits, but they just don't know when and where that's going to be. And it was just, that moment actually really struck me. This is back in 2020 or 2021, where I was like, yeah, where is this stuff? Where are these LLMs headed? Like, this is actually really like exciting. And so I was very civically minded, cared about politics, all that kind of DC stuff. And I went to AI.gov. That was the website for all things AI in the government, and the website was down. And so I was just like kind of trying to reconcile. I'm like, here's this super powerful, artificial intelligence capability that's coming online in the next few years. And then I go to the AI.gov and it's not working. So it didn't instill a lot of confidence that, the government was actually preparing adequately for the rise of this tech. And then that's when the Pentagon coincidentally asked me like, hey, do you want to come work on AI and the Defense Digital Service over there? And I have zero military background. In fact, to be honest, I never even considered a life in like national security, especially in undergrad, especially at Berkeley, right? But things changed, and here we are. So I'm gonna get more into kind of that post ChatGPT moment. All right, so defining the problem, again, Ezra Klein, he did a great episode the other day with Ben Buchanan, who was former President Biden's AI advisor. They talked about how looming AGI is to making an impact in the US government, and both the role of the United States government as a regulator of AGI, but also as a user. So highly recommend you guys taking a look at or giving a listen. It came out a couple of weeks ago. But obviously I'm focused, I was in DoD, I'm focused on mapping AGI to the Department of Defense, which is a very loaded question, and I get a lot of concerns or either blank stares or hyperventilating when I talk about this stuff. But I fundamentally think that this is probably one of the most important things I will do or have done up until this point with respect to making an impact in government. So I feel like I don't even need to have this slide for this audience or even people in a 50-mile radius of this audience. This is for everybody outside of this bubble. But defining what AGI is, just so we're kind of level setting there. Artificial general intelligence, the hypothetical intelligence of a machine that possesses the ability to understand or learn any intellectual task that a human being can. And that's Google's AI Lab definition. It's not necessarily Skynet. I don't know if you guys are old enough for Terminator, but that was a big thing where Skynet kind of took over, and that's left its mark on society in terms of fear of AGI. We'll just say that. It's also, AGI is not inherently nefarious. I think people kind of project that onto AI and AGI a lot. And it's also not omniscient. It's not all-knowing. It doesn't have access to every known underlying system. I kind of have a funny story. I was in New York City last weekend, and this guy, this true story, came up to me, and he was lost. Obviously, he's from out of town. And I was like, okay, show me your maps. I'll try to help you out or something. And he pulled up on his phone. He was using ChatGPT for directions. And immediately I knew what the problem was. And it turned out when we looked at Google Maps, the train that ChatGPT had recommended was out of service that day, but obviously ChatGPT doesn't have some sort of Google Maps API integration right now. But it was actually pretty profound because I'm it's not super intuitive that ChatGPT would not be able to navigate New York City. That seems like a very easy thing to do, right? A 12-year-old could do that. But just because we have great reasoning agents and all this stuff doesn't mean that they're automatically connected to every single API or knowledge base in the world, right? And then, okay, so we just talked about the AGI side of the equation. Let's talk about the DoD. So maybe I'm also explaining this to an audience that already gets this, but the DoD, it is guys, it is so hard to fathom how large the DoD is. That is one thing, I've only been in for 3 years, but it's over 3 million people. It's the largest organization in the world. No one comes close. It's bigger than Apple, Google, Amazon, Walmart combined, I think. It's when I tell you, it is so hard to wrap your brain around the scale of this one singular department. So we have, obviously, Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States. Yes. Right below that, we have the Secretary of Defense. We have the military departments, the Army, Navy, Air Force. And then we have all these combatant commands. So we have these kind of geographic combatant commands, AFRICOM, guess where that is. INDOPACOM, that's Indo-Pacific, that's half the planet. But then we also have they're called functional combatant commands. We have SOCOM, that's Special Operations Command. TRANSCOM, that's for transportation. And for this fiscal year, we have a budget of $850 billion, which gets a lot of scrutiny, and a lot of people talk about that, rightfully so. We'll see what the budget is next year. But one superlative that I really like to throw in when I kind of give these talks is this last bullet here, which is the fact that the DoD runs one of the largest K through 12 school districts in the world, larger than San Francisco. And I like to throw that in there because I think people, when they think of the DoD, rightfully so, we all think about lethal capabilities, the warfighter, front lines, 100% the top priority, don't get it twisted. But then you look at these kind of not statistics, but these sort of statements, And you realize like the scope and how broad the DoD really is across 3 million people, right? It runs one of the largest school districts, bigger than SF. And so what I would like recommend that you guys do just throughout your course or your interest in national security is to realize like the whole support system that is empowered to manifest that lethal capability. Does that make sense? So it's not exclusively, lethal jets and kinetic systems, although those are incredibly important. It's this whole field of supply chain, all these sorts of logistics operations. So I just like to throw that in there. I can't even begin to go over the history of AI in the DoD. I mean, we're going back to 1958. That's before most of even our parents were born, I'm assuming. So I'm not going to even attempt to adequately convey the role that the DoD's played in AI. DARPA, which was officially created back in 1958, has really funded most of the foundational AI research that we now appreciate today. And so it's just played an enormous role. Again, I'm really like seemingly trivializing the role that DARPA's played, but for the past like 70 years, it's been instrumental in not just the DoD's role in AI, but like the whole world's access to different AI research. And then something called Project Maven came around in 2017, okay? So Project Maven, have you guys heard of Maven? Maybe, I don't know, probably not. Maven was basically this idea that we could take like computer vision, basic object detection stuff, and apply it to satellite imagery, which is great and had been done many times before in the past. But the difference with Maven, and to this day it's still around, was it was one of the first like AI products to actually be implemented in the Department of Defense. Meaning not AI research, not a bunch of nerds. I can say that because I'm called a nerd all the time. It's not a bunch of nerds like in some silo doing an experiment, but the actual end users of Maven being able to parse satellite imagery, look at different objects, we'll just say, and different satellite images, is used by like deeply non-technical people. And that is something super incredible that I pay a lot of tribute to, because had that not come before us, that was like, for the most part, a lot of people in DoD's literal experience whatsoever with AI. And so that was kind of the narrow AI era that I chalk up to the last like 70 years, which is a lot. But today, I've only been in the DoD since kind of the advent of this latest generative AI wave, so I can only kind of speculate and comment on that. I'm going to talk about Task Force Lima. That was the DoD's generative AI task force. Something called NIPR-GPT, which we'll get into. And then how that could and probably will lead to AGI down the line. A couple things off the top, like to be mindful of, that I think are just really fascinating. Like I mentioned, DARPA has largely funded AI research, right, over the past like 60, 70 years. What was really interesting with transformers, which are the underlying thing that power large language models for most part, was like directly funded by Google and not DoD. And so one of my colleagues brought this up the other day, and I just thought it was really interesting because some may argue that this is like a bug, not a feature of like the government's role in funding AI, right? Like should the government have funded this research in the first place? Like, was that a lapse in foresight? Some may argue that like the private sector is more efficient in funding research and so forth. So I see both sides to the argument, but I just thought that was really interesting. And really what like the end state that we're trying to get at is to be able to take AI labs, best models, and apply them to the DoD. A lot of back and forth over the past couple of years. All sorts of people across the national security world want to like pre-train their own LLMs. And while it sounds like really cool and sexy, it's really, really hard because of all sorts of legal implications. People are always saying like, oh, well, the government has all this data. It's like, well, we can't legally use it or easily use it to be as agile as what an AI lab would be able to give us for various like legal indemnification stuff. But that's really where we're headed. And lastly, like AI and DoD, what I just mentioned, we're trying to move from research, from these silos where you have all these AI labs that have national security funding, which are incredible and do great work. We're trying to move though from research to production, to people with zero experience in AI, like barely know how to, use Microsoft Word, like getting them access to these AI products. That's like my metric of success. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how with generative AI, we've been able to do that in pretty short succession. All right, so Task Force Lima, okay. DoD's Generative AI Task Force 2023 to 2024. I still don't know why they use this logo, but you kind of just don't ask questions. So I was the technical lead of Task Force Lima. My job was to kind of inform from a technical perspective how things are rolled out, what we invest in, the strategy, the policy. So I'll kind of lay out how this all came to fruition. ChatGPT, November 2022, we all know that. Task Force Lima, in that interim period, so between like November 2022 and the following summer, there's all sorts of discussions across DC, from the former President Biden's AI Advisory Council to just across the different departments. And they all recognize like AI is really powerful, blah, 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 but it's like what do we do with it? Like literally, do we just give everyone ChatGPT? Like what does this actually mean? And so the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, former Deputy SecDef, her name is Kathleen Hicks, and they said, okay, we're gonna do something about this. We don't really know what we're doing, but like, we're gonna make a task force to try to figure everything out. And so they kept this like mission statement for Task Force Lima extremely broad. Task Force Lima will develop, evaluate, recommend, and monitor the implementation of GenAI across DoD and use GenAI responsibly and securely. So they kept it very broad intentionally because it was still, for government, very early days. And then we had the Biden AI executive order. This was back about a couple of months later. That further kind of codified at like the presidential level, some of the mandates that we needed to fulfill, a lot of the things that we were already doing. For example, the AI executive order mandated like every department has to have like a chief AI officer and like things like that. So that was great. It was very high level though, so not like super helpful. But what came out like 6 months ago was former President Biden's AI national security memo, which was obviously very relevant to us. And what that memo really did was kind of more explicitly mandate and set out directionally like what the different elements of the national security community should be working on, from Department of Energy, the intelligence community, DoD. And that was, they actually set deadlines on that. You need to do X, Y, and Z by these dates. And then moving on to current President Trump's AI action plan. So very early on to President Trump's administration, he rescinded most of the executive actions that the former president took, especially with respect to artificial intelligence. And we'll see about the national security memo. We're not sure if that's going to get chopped or not. But the Trump administration, they kind of want a clean slate. And so they put out a request over the past couple of weeks, which I submitted to, about like recommendations that the White House should take to both figure out how to regulate AI with their kind of philosophy on regulation, as well as like AI adoption and the barriers that exist to that. So they're still working on this. They haven't published anything, but we'll see how that goes. And yeah, that image of that guy in the corner, that was my former boss. He's a former chief AI officer of the Pentagon. And we announced Task Force Lima at DEF CON in 2023. So DEF CON has really been, I don't know if you guys attend or whatever, but we have a presence there every single year. Last year, we demonstrated stuff that I'll talk about. And also, back in 2023, we were there with the AI Village demonstrating red teaming of LLMs, especially like in national security domains. All right, so here are the different like dimensions to think about Task Force Lima from. I'll go through these: policy, authorization, experimenting, alignment, scaling, and community. All right, so on the policy side, I used to literally not care about policy at all. I don't have a policy background. But when I came to the DoD, when you're an organization of 3 million people, policy is everything. Like everyone really, really cares about this stuff. So we leaned into that. And one of the first things that we did with Task Force Lima was sign off at like the Secretary of Defense level guidance for DoD on generative AI. And at a high level, we saw what was going on. People wanted to use ChatGPT. It had already been around for a year. They wanted to do all these different things with it. And so we weren't saying we're going to get in your way and stop all use of this technology. We were just saying, basically, our guidance said, like, be smart, like, don't be stupid, don't like use it in the wrong ways or and get people into trouble. So the 4 main dimensions there for that guidance at the Secretary of Defense level for generative AI was being able to assess and mitigate risk with LLMs. If you connect, we all know about like hallucinations and all sorts of vulnerabilities that these LLMs have a tendency to do. Input restrictions, again, this is like, I thought this was a no-brainer, but like you shouldn't put top secret information into chatgpt.com. That needed to be codified, and like people needed to know that these were not secure systems. And we ran into that with DeepSeek. Anyways, but accountability, basically we set the precedent that says like, hey, if you use ChatGPT to generate any text and use that in a document, a memo, whatever it is, you are 100% accountable for like everything that memo says, and every like end product of that text. Because there was just a lot of situations where people would shift the blame and be like, oh, well, I used ChatGPT to write this, so it's not my fault. And it's like, no, it is your fault. And then lastly, citation, basically like instructing 3 million people in the department to be very rigorous in verifying the veracity of like what these LLMs were generating in terms of the text. And then, so that was at the Secretary of Defense level. Over the years, like over the past 2 years, again, we have different military departments. So each one, Army, Navy, Air Force, started to issue their own generative AI guidance. A little bit of tension there. Some departments are more risk averse than others. So but I would say most of that has kind of like consolidated, and there was pretty much parity across military departments. And then a couple of months ago, the generative AI, there was a responsible AI toolkit that my organization put out. And we put out a more specific and honed in responsible AI toolkit for generative AI to kind of educate people across the DoD, like who want to use these technology, but don't really know how to do it responsibly. It's not called responsible AI anymore. It's called like, I don't know. They don't like the word responsible anymore, but yeah. So that's something that came out. All right, authorization. So the DoD really cares about authorizing stuff. Again, like I used to not care about authorization at all. But when you're dealing with the world's most sensitive information, obviously you want to make sure these systems are secure, right? And things are authorized and by the book. So what's an ATO? Okay, if you are wanting to build anything in like national security, you're gonna have to get an ATO, like I guarantee it. An ATO is an authorization to operate. And it's granted by these people, they're literally people, authorizing officials. I think there's like 60 of them across the DoD. So when you think about the math, that ratio, 60 people across 3 million employees, they have a lot on their plate at all times. The problem that we ran into really early on was like, how do you authorize an unbounded LLM? People want to use these LLMs and generative AI stuff for general purpose chatbots, right? Use ChatGPT to write you a poem and then like make the Ghibli studio image or whatever thing. And so you want to be able to use it for all these different use cases. But when you go to authorize any software, like it needs to be deterministic. You need to be able to prove like, hey, we rigorously tested against like all these different things and here's how it performed. So that was one of the most difficult things to address, is working with these authorizing officials and trying to educate them and communicate what that risk is to them and be like, hey, here's a trade-off. Instead of using generative AI for like, connecting them to nuclear weapons, why don't we start off with using it to generate like memos for people living in barracks or something, like very low stakes stuff where no one will die. And that's kind of been the handshake agreement between people in the AI community and the authorizing officials. And we hope that gets escalated over time. So authorize LLM pipeline to the various DoD impact levels. So impact levels, all right. You guys may have heard there are different levels of like classification and the intelligence community and in DoD. So we have like impact level, what is it, 2, it skips 3, it goes to 4, 5, 6, and then there's more. But what we had to work really hard on is getting large language models from the AI labs or open source, running them through all the security stuff, cybersecurity stuff, to get to whether it's secret or top secret or these different networks that exist across the national security community. It's really, really hard. And so it's kind of bifurcated into 2 different classes. We got open weight models and we have closed weight models. People get mad when I say open source. So open weight, right? So with open weight models, they're often easy, open weight LLMs, they're easier to get authorized and access to because we can literally just go on the internet and pull them ourselves. Like we don't need anyone's blessing. But they can be harder to use because we have to figure out and orchestrate everything on the back end in terms of the GPUs where the LLMs run on, making sure the inference time is fast enough, like 10 million other different things. And so one of the largest things, this was probably the biggest moment in like AI, large language model or generative AI history for the DoD was this. Back last year, when Meta granted the DoD an exemption for using their Llama, that's like their large language model family, models in military domains. So up until that point, Meta had a blanket ban for any military use, right? So we, the US government, we couldn't use Llama models. And I mean, technically nobody could, but like our adversaries, they don't necessarily listen to the law, but like we, the US government, should, right? And so this is a really big game changer because I think it's fair to say like 90+% of all DoD generative AI was using Llama models, like actually. And so there was a lot of work with Meta to get that exemption, and that was a really big deal. And so now that that's kind of more or less figured out, now we're moving on to the barrier, which is these closed weight models. So think OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera. The thing is, it's harder to get authorized and access to these closed weight models, but it's easier to use. So over the past 2 years, more so this year, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, they're starting to get authorizations for their models in these different like DoD environments, different networks, cloud providers, things like that. But I think a lot of people, I've had tension with people over this, they think it's either or. They're like, we should either only use open source or only an OpenAI or Anthropic. I think what's been really powerful is to see the competitive ecosystem emerge, because otherwise, without, I think, that tension, like these companies aren't going to move as quickly in terms of getting their stuff available to the DoD. So it's been pretty cool to see, especially this year, a lot of things get authorized and like a much more competitive AI ecosystem emerge across the department. All right, so moving on. So I was a technical lead for Task Force Lima. So like hands-on keyboard, was building up a lot of different experiments and trying out use cases. At the outset of the task force, we got this mandate, which was like, hey, the Pentagon wants to basically figure out like, how is generative AI being used across 3 million people, which is like a massive mandate where we're like, okay, we'll create basically like a Google form and we'll just blast it out across the military, and we'll see what people like come back with. And so that had mixed results because it turns out people like would just come up with an idea in the shower and then they just submit the form and be like, oh, I have an idea for generative AI in the military, which is a big difference between like that actually being used and like operational use. So I think there was a little bit of mixed feedback in terms of us being able to identify how generative AI was like statistically and the distribution of use across the department. But you know, we learned by doing. There was a lot of different deployments that I had the privilege of doing. crazy stories, like literally doing an LLM deployment in a hurricane, which was wild, and my shoes were destroyed, but the LLM worked. So I was like, okay, that's great. We did a hackathon, Bravo, which is like the DoD's largest hackathon series. We're talking like 700 people. We did a lot of LM deployments there where people were able to bring like private citizens, like not just civilians, like regular people, into these different DoD environments and have them hack together solutions, which is really cool. And then we have demonstrated a lot of things at DEF CON. Usually we build stuff out for people across the military, and at DEF CON we're able to kind of show a redacted version of that. But the two main things that I have here are we call him Combi. He's basically an LLM-powered robot with different modalities. So you can see vision. There's also a microphone powered by a Raspberry Pi. So a lot of implications in DoD with that. And then I'm holding this walkie-talkie here. We call it Radio GPT. We embedded conversational AI agents into different radio networks that soldiers use across the world, with the idea of kind of streamlining communication and doing a number of other things, but being able to embed that AI agent or that conversational agent into an existing network and have it be able to interface with like n number of people on that network is kind of difficult. And then lastly, we also published using large language models against in the context of cyber defense operations. So the DoD is comprised of like 1 million different networks. It's not just like one. So we deployed an LLM onto a network and used it to basically monitor the traffic to identify like, hey, we're getting traffic from China. That might not be a good idea. Let's identify that as like, one, bad, and two, draft a way to respond to that, to like shut that down. Yeah, a lot of great experiments, a lot of lost sleep, but really, really happy that I got to do this. And then we started to realize like over the past year that we need DoD-specific evaluation and alignment. All the models that we get access to, the OpenAIs, the Metas, all that stuff, like they're just the base models, right? And so those models are aligned for like all of society's use. But we were running into things where it's like, let's say hypothetically, I wanted to use like a OpenAI chatbot. This is totally hypothetical, okay? And I want it to be like, help me create a draft like war plans with adversarial country X. Totally hypothetical. Well, these LLMs will come back and be like, as an AI model, I'm not allowed to, engage in warfare and blah, 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 which, yes, we probably want that for the general public. We don't want like the average Joe making war plans with adversaries, but like we want that, right? So how do we get around that in an empirical way, but still leverage the incredible capability of these base models? So did various work with Scale AI, where they attempted to do something like this. It was a start, right? And then we had a couple other different people outside of our organization publish different like military-specific benchmarks, which sounds like germane and random, but it's actually like what I think the most important thing that the DoD needs to do. Talk about capability gaps, right? And then another thing that I was able to publish was the DoD's first large language model operations framework. So the idea being here is that we're able to take open source LLMs from Meta or Mistral or a number of others and align them to like DoD domains, okay? So this was back in like 2020, end of 2023. But the idea was it's a series of these open source LLMs fine-tuned on publicly available DoD information. Obviously, there's different versions of it that are not public. And so the first main one that we made a big splash with was, it's called Axon 7B policy. Basically, the idea is we took DoD policies going back since like the 1940s or something crazy. And then we extracted those policies, converted them into like supervised fine-tuning data sets, fine-tune underlying base models, and then hosted these models in different like applications. So here's like one example of a DoD issuance. So you can see that one's from like January 2005. And so I won't go into detail here, but basically the idea is like being able to extract Q&A, question and answer pairs against these DoD domains, use that to fine tune and create benchmarks on we'll just say constrained compute. We don't have like very expensive compute. We have like lower tier compute. So that was that on that. And then I think this is the last one on the Task Force Lima side, which was scaling. So going back to my underlying thesis of like moving from AI research to production, there was kind of this discussion as to whether we should be using DoDs and the national security communities, they're called HPCs, so high performance like computing centers, or should we be using like cloud compute? So the DoD, especially the Department of Energy, speaking of national security, the Department of Energy has like crazy GPU clusters like all over the place. The problem is that like we can't use any of that because it's not on the right network. It's not on the, doesn't have the right authorizations and stuff, which is so frustrating. I'm like, why do we spend $1 billion on this? But you know, there was the school of thought that we should be using that. But then we also looked at, which was a little bit more of a pragmatic of an approach, which is like, let's just use AWS, or let's just use Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud, because they've really got the compute game down to a science. And so we did a couple of different experiments. We deployed Axon, which I talked about, onto DoD compute at the different like classifications, and learned a lot there. I think the main takeaway was, if you're doing AI research, HPCs are great and fantastic, but when you move to production, it really falls apart. And that's when you really need to use an AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft or Oracle. Those are the four main people there. Going back to scaling, the hardest thing I had to do was, people would come to me all the time and they'd be like, you know, how many GPUs should we buy across these different impact levels and air gap networks? So let's say at a impact level 6, okay, that's like the secret level, okay? Imagine we buy GPUs for that. Well, if we want to use GPUs on a different network, there's physically no way to connect that. So like, once they go into that secure room, they're not coming out. Like those GPUs are there until the day they die, or kind of. And so trying to predict how to accurately allocate these GPUs, knowing it's irrevocable, like I cannot take those GPUs outside of the room once they're put in, was really, really difficult. And I think I learned a lot about basically to be more product driven when it comes to predicting GPU allocation versus just me arbitrarily coming up with something in my head. Different things we ran into in terms of scaling generative AI across the department is like kind of basic things, like do we pay for all this GPU, all this compute centrally, or do we pass the cost on to end users and customers? That wasn't really clear. There's like trade-offs to both. What do we buy? You know, what's a reasonable, like, I remember, especially in the early days of Task Force Lima, we had no idea what price points were reasonable. So if someone came to us and were like, oh, we'll sell you an LLM for like $15 million, it'd be like, okay, cool. And then someone comes the next day and it's like, we'll charge you $100,000. We're like, oh, what? Like, these are very, you know, like several orders of magnitude off. But because the market was so early, you have no idea what to kind of like center your price point around. And so as an engineer myself, there was a lot of tension between like, should I just build the tools internally and scale it myself and sustain it? And at what point do I hand that off to another private contractor or one of the main national security companies to do that? That was a huge thing that we had to address. And then lastly, NIPR-GPT. So NIPR-GPT, like, I feel confident in saying this, is the biggest AI product to have ever impacted the Department of Defense. Like, it's not even close. It is absolutely NIPR-GPT. Basically, you can, I mean, simply, it is pretty much ChatGPT on this thing called Nipper. Nipper is our like unclassified DoD network. But it has grown in scale. Again, we're talking 3 million people, right, across the department. So it has grown to scale to a lot of people. I can't give the exact number, but it's been really phenomenal because we learned a lot through Nipper GPT and the roadblocks that they experienced. So for example, they were trying to scale up to meet all the immense demand that they needed, or that they already had, okay? And like very early on, I won't call out which company did this, but like we all know them. And this company goes to every like national security conference, and like if you live in DC, every like subway is like plastered with their stuff on it. And they're always saying like, oh, we're using AI to transform national security, blah, blah, blah. And so Nipper GPT went to that company and was like, great, you guys are doing AI national security, like, let's use your GPUs. And that company was like, great, okay, we got 3. And the team was like, okay, maybe we can make do with 3, maybe we'll try to make do with that. And they were like, oh, no, we have 3 for like the whole United States government, 3 GPUs for a 5 million person organization. So it means we have to like tussle it out or fight it out with like Department of Justice for like 1 GPU. So it was one of like the most revealing moments though, because when push came to shove, despite all the fuss that these companies make and give talks and like all these fancy things, it's like when it really came down to it, they didn't have the compute, they didn't have what we needed. And this was not even that long, this was last year. And then, sorry, this might be the last one, I'm losing track. The last thing that we did majorly was really like convene a large community across the United States government. So one of the main things I did was briefing people across the US government and military leadership. So that's me in the White House, shameless enough to ask for a photo. 4-star generals across combatant commands, the Department of Energy, all that kind of stuff. And then we also did these like quarterly sessions where we had open dialogue across the department, where we'd have people come and be like, hey, we're working on X, Y, and Z, or we have this problem, we want policy to do all these things. Because remember, we sit at the Secretary of Defense level, so a lot of people are like kind of look to us to set the course, to advocate, go through the right channel, go to Congress, liaison with them to get funding for the right GPUs, all that kind of stuff. And then one of the main things I did was I called them large language model office hours, where every couple of weeks I would convene like over 200 DoD AI scientists and practitioners to catch up on like the latest advancements. And that was super important actually, because a lot of the problems that we were able to identify and address throughout the department, for example, Meta having a military prohibition on their LLM use cases, that was something that was bubbled up to us through this like office hours. And then we're able to go to like, the National Security Council and be like, hey guys, like, please let us use this stuff. And it ended up working out. And then, yes, industry engagements, we've met with maybe even too many AI companies at this point, all the AI labs. They would give us a heads up and be like, hey, we're working on X, Y, and Z. There's this new capability coming out. So that was helpful because when things would be rolled out, we weren't totally caught off guard. And when we get questions about its impact on like national security, we kind of had a go-to answer for that. And then lastly, I keep saying lastly, open source contributions. So ironically, like it's really hard to send stuff even internally in the DoD. Like I can't even send an image to someone in the Air Force. Like that's how segmented everything is. So we publish a lot of things publicly on GitHub. I own the DoD Hugging Face, which is kind of a Hugging Face, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like GitHub, but for AI models. And it was kind of this funny moment where like I emailed Hugging Face to like have them create an account for the DoD, and they're like, who are you? Like, I'm like, I'm the military, can you please create a verified account? And they did, like literally overnight, which is awesome. So shout out to them for that. So Task Force Lima a couple of months ago came to a conclusion. This is the unclassified, publicly distributed final report. It's literally only like 5 pages. Unfortunately, the final report is like much longer, but things kind of get, I don't want to say redacted, but removed as they get published publicly. But at a high level, the final report basically said, hey, generative AI, it's not hype, or it's not all hype, there's some hype, but some of it is actually super useful for different operational and administrative use cases. The generative AI space is changing literally by the day. I have so many stories where I would do a deployment, it wouldn't work, and then like a new model would come out by the next day, and I'd be like, all right, let's go. We need more evaluations for generative AI in the military. We have like none, bar like a couple of great attempts at it. And we need to scale these promising like LLM chatbots that exist in the wild, like Nipper GPT. So, if you guys want to read this, just Google Task Force Lima. It should be like the first thing that pops up. Okay, and so now here's like the sexier part of the talk, right? Where I talk more about where this is all going, the barriers that we still have like at this very second, and how we can unblock them. So again, I know you guys are like interested in entrepreneurship. My background's in startups, so I have a soft spot for that. As I talk through these different barriers that exist and blockers, think about like how maybe you could craft a startup around that. I don't know. So on the right side of your screen, I submitted this to the White House in my unofficial capacity a couple weeks ago. Remember that AI action plan I told you Trump's team is working on to like, figure out, because they rescinded all the AI, they took away all of Biden's AI executive actions and they want to replace it with their own. So this was my attempt to, given my experience, to recommend like basically what they should do. And these are going to be like very targeted policy recommendations that seem very boring, but these are like, in terms of bringing AGI to the government for use, like this is it. So really what preparing the DoD and even just like the whole US government for AGI, what that looks like is building these like secure pipelines. So AI labs, OpenAI, Meta, Anthropic, et cetera, taking those model weights, putting them into these government accredited clouds. So Amazon has a cloud, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle that are pre-accredited by the government, but also have the ability to like very quickly move these model weights in. And then you're able to give access in the form of like web apps, ChatGPT stuff to the end users. Really what we need to do is shorten this part of the cycle. So let's say OpenAI drops a model like, today. It may take us, 3 months, for example, to get those model weights into this government environment that we can use, okay? What I want to do, or what I'm recommending, is for us to shorten that cycle. So maybe it only takes 2 weeks or a couple of days. And they're starting to shorten that more and more. But that's, we can't wait a year or 2 years and have like too big of a delay. So I'll quickly go over these: acquisition, authorization, infrastructure, data, and R&D. These are kind of the keystones, I think, to being able to even facilitate an AGI down the road across the DoD and the government. So on the acquisition and adoption side, just get people access to these AI chatbots. Just like put it in front of their face. I go to all these panels and these conferences and people talk my head off about like how we need to think about AI and LLMs and this and that. And I'm just like, dude, just literally put a chatbot in front of your user base, or in front of your workforce, and see what happens. Maybe it'll suck. But my recommendation was to the White House to basically gather all the CIOs, the chief information officers across the government, and say, all right, you guys have like 6 months, get 10% of your workforce access to these chatbots, or else you're fired. Next one, defining frontier AI, like what that actually means. So in all these AI executive actions, the national security memo that Biden had a couple of months ago for AI, his AI executive order, they all say like, the government needs to invest in frontier AI. Like we need to go all in on this. But it's like, literally, what does that mean? that there's no sort of empirical metrics to be able to point to, especially for government use. So my recommendation was like, all right, basically get a lot of the different scientists at NIST who are scientists in government, get them to create benchmarks and a public LLM leaderboard for government use, not for like software engineering benchmarks, which are not super relevant to government use, or slightly, but not entirely. But evaluate these models against different military domains. If you are, for example, if you're in the Department of State and you're a Foreign Service officer, like you should know how well these LLMs perform against the Foreign Service Officer exam. Like that's kind of the bare minimum. SAM.gov, that's where like a lot of contracts are listed, millions or hundreds of thousands of government contracts are listed there for different companies to come bid on. So I recommended making it easier basically to just sift through all of those and be able to have like an AI subcategory. So if you are an AI company or an AI startup and you want to be able to just like quickly go through, tens of thousands of offerings and actually compete and bid on them, that's one solution. And then lastly, a recommendation on like how we basically buy AI compute instead of buying it in terms of like, let's just buy 10,000 GPUs and have them sitting in a SCIF. More so buy them through the cloud service providers. Microsoft and Amazon, they will always be better at running LLMs than the government, like full stop. All right, authorization. Again, getting into the weeds here, but long story short, in the government, there are two types of like authorizations. There's what the DoD and intelligence community use, and then there's the rest of the government. So the rest of the government uses something called FedRAMP, and then DoD and intelligence community uses these like impact level things. My thing is like, I think it's dumb to have two separate authorizations. What that means is like, even small companies have to pay twice to authorize their stuff, and that just makes it really hard for companies to compete. The next one, fast track these authorizations for large language model APIs. So if you guys have experimented with like the OpenAI API or literally any AI API, they're super useful. They are very efficient on cost and so forth. And so what we want to see happen is those APIs in the different impact levels, at different classified levels, to get authorized. So that means that people, whether it's the government, whether it's you guys building a startup, can immediately on day one use an OpenAI API, and you don't have to go from scratch and like try to do all these authorizations just to get like a kind of a lame LLM. And then, this is a hot one. Okay, guidance for using foreign-based large language models. Do you guys know DeepSeek? Have you guys heard of DeepSeek? Okay, so that kind of caused a lot of trouble in national security over the past couple of months. Long story short, DeepSeek is a model family trained out of AI lab-ish company in China, and they made their models open source, which is good, but unfortunately a lot of people in national security got very excited and started to use those DeepSeek models in some different national security ways, which was just very dumb. I was like, oh my God, guys. So one is issue guidance for like what happens when Russia or China has a model that's better than OpenAI, maybe one day, not saying that's today, but like maybe that's the future. So NSA, CISA, NIST, those are a lot of different cybersecurity and intelligence folks across the government. Basically, everyone get together and come up with a strategy that says, yeah, OpenAI is front of the line, Anthropic's front of the line today, but what if tomorrow it's not? What do we do? Are we still allowed to use it? In what context are we allowed to use it? Are we allowed to use it with top secret information? Yes or no? Like, we need to have some sort of like guidance, because right now it's a total free-for-all. And certainly, I mean, the worst possible thing that I've seen was people in national security using DeepSeek's website, like whatever the website is, deepseek.com or something. which literally sent information to China. Like the servers are literally in China, like direct. So we need to absolutely, if we want to see AGI and all these sorts of performant models get adopted, like we need to cut that shit out. It's like one of the biggest risks. On the infrastructure side, so people don't really like to talk about these secure facilities, or, SCIFs. I don't know if people have heard of them. That's where you're able to do classified things. But actually the specs to build these classified facilities are public information. Like you can just Google on the Office of the Director of National Intelligence's website and the DoD, they literally spell out like, here's what a room, like if we wanted to convert this room in order to be able to do classified things in this room, these are just like 500-page PDFs that spell that out. What my recommendation is that, all right, if we want to bring large language models into these spaces, we need to kind of revisit these specifications for what it may require to have like GPUs and compute in them. So one hypothetical example is like some accelerator types, we all know GPUs, but there are other things like Google has TPUs, these tensor processing units. They require liquid cooling, okay? Like water going in and out to make sure it doesn't like melt. But according to these like specifications for how SCIFs and these secure facilities are built, we can't have water going in and out. So they need to revisit that and be like, all right, we want to make sure we have the best AI models in these classified places without it literally burning to the ground. Let's update these ICD 705 and like it's super specific. Moving on, HPC to cloud connectivity. So like I said, people often say like the DoD needs to spend more money on compute. It's not that, unfortunately. It's not that we don't spend money on compute, it's that we don't spend money on like compute in the right places. So you'll see all sorts of press releases all the time. The government, across the government, DoD, Department of Energy, they're all tout like, hey, we spent $10 billion on like this new GPU supercluster. The problem is that no one uses these, where these compute clusters live, these HPCs. That's not where people's data lives. That's not where the warfighter lives. Like that, those things are very disparate. And so my recommendation is to like force these billions of dollars worth of compute to connect to AWS, to Microsoft's Azure, to Google Cloud, so that we can deploy apps in the way that like everyone likes to deploy apps in the cloud, but also leverage like these massive compute resources that, especially the Department of Energy just has like, I don't want to say sitting around, but kind of. And then we also need to incentivize cloud companies to invest in compute capacity. Okay, so I dealt with this a lot up until my last few days in the Pentagon a couple of weeks ago. Imagine like I'm AWS, I'm a cloud company, okay? And again, DoD networks, these are all air gap networks. So I can either take like, several $10,000 worth of GPUs and compute, and I can put them in the commercial environment where I know everyone in the world is gonna wanna use it, right? For sure. Or I can put it in like a government environment where it's like, I don't know if people are gonna use it, are people gonna pay for this? There's so many unknowns. And so remember earlier in this discussion, I talked about how NipperGPT, the DoD's AI chatbot, when they tried to go get compute, they had 3 GPUs for the whole government. Well, that's why, because these cloud companies are like, even I know these people at these companies, and they have to beg even internally to their leadership, because the executives at these cloud companies are like, why would we, spend all this money on highly sought after compute when we could just put it in the commercial environment and for sure people will use it. So what the government needs to do is kind of do some shenanigans in terms of like providing either subsidies or these like minimum usage contracts, basically telling cloud companies, hey, please bring compute to these environments. We pinky promise we're gonna use it. And then also, we talk about GPUs all the time. That's NVIDIA's main thing. But we also need to incentivize different diverse compute types. Right now, GPUs are really dominating, but I think that's kind of more of a first mover advantage. There's other things. I mentioned tensor processing units, which need liquid cooling, which goes back to the first point. We have like, what is it, language model units or something like that from Grok. So we need to, like, yes, GPUs are dominating today, but we need to be very open to acquiring whatever the best, fastest compute accelerator is. And then this one is kind of wonky, but long story short, there have been a lot of instances where, like, the DoD, have a bunch of data, okay? And I want to do fine-tuning stuff with like these LLMs and do all sorts of fancy stuff. But what happens is when we go to buy these capabilities from different companies, we don't have it in the contract that basically spells out like what the government owns and what the companies own. And so these FAR and DFARs, these are the regulations that kind of regulate how the government buys things. And so what my plea is to basically mandate that if you're going to buy any LLMs, AI, whatever, that you need to specify where the government's data stops and like starts, because otherwise we're going to run into this problem a million times, and this has already happened, where basically the government has to buy back its own data, which is a very perverse and messed up thing. So we need to address that. And then we also need to, going back to the DoD's roots with DARPA of funding AI research, we need to continue to fund AI research, different architectures. So one of the things I'm like really passionate about these days is homomorphic encryption of large language models. Basically, what this would enable in its its final state would be end-to-end encryption of large language models. So like you guys use iMessage or Signal, which is another popular app in the DoD. Those apps are encrypted end-to-end, and that's why they're so popular. So they're, sorry, Signal threw me off. But that really contrasts with like what ChatGPT is today, or literally any AI application that you use. It's not end-to-end encrypted. Of course, if we want to use LLMs and AI with very sensitive payloads and national security, think like the most highly classified data that exists, to be able to have guarantees that the information is encrypted the entire way through is huge. And so I think we should fund that. And then there's also all these different more efficient AI architectures that are starting to emerge, which maybe they'll beat out transformers and attention and all that. I don't know. But we need to, I think we need to continue to fund that because it's in our best interest selfishly. But like, if there's one thing that you guys have a takeaway today, is that the DoD needs benchmarks. Like, it's kind of funny, I do a lot of different talks and stuff, and I think people are expecting, I led generative AI for the Pentagon, and people are expecting me to talk about AI agents and RAG and like, what is it, like model context protocol, which just popped up 5 seconds ago. But everything comes back to benchmarks. I fundamentally disagree with, I see a lot of like AI influencers, especially national security, they think there's like one benchmark to rule them all. I just think that's like totally not true. Like you wouldn't, try to assess someone's ability to handle nuclear material with like the SAT, right? We need domain-specific benchmarks that are we need thousands of them, tens of thousands. If you're a foreign service officer and you're a diplomat, you need to know that these LLMs perform well against, the foreign service officer exam, which everyone has to take in the Department of State as a diplomat. There are a million different like manifestations of this, but benchmarks, like we do not have any of these. And if we want to get to AGI, like it is all, I believe personally, it is all predicated on our ability to evaluate the performance, not at a high level, not like, not at a level that people would use in their day-to-day to write a poem or something, but like very downstream, like actually with the warfighter and how they're using it on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, that's actually it. If you want to find out more information, just Google Task Force Lima. AI.mil, that's my parent organization's name, or former parent organization's name. There's this thing called the Deferred Resignation Program. So I sort of resigned like 2 to 3 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago for various reasons. So that's what AI.mil is the chief AI office of the Pentagon. If you guys want to read more about kind of everything that I submitted to the White House, bringing LLMs to the US government, that's my website. And I highly recommend you guys listen to the Ezra Klein podcast. The government knows AGI is coming. He does a great job. It's about an hour long, but it's pretty comprehensive. And even though he's interviewing Ben Buchanan, who is Biden's AI, sort of AI czar sort of thing, I think President Trump's administration, although I know they rescinded a lot of the AI executive actions, I think we're not going to see it's pretty non-partisan or bipartisan in terms of how people are thinking about this stuff. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I know I threw a lot at you guys, so if you guys have any questions, please let me know. You can always just email me. I'll leave my email is just glenn@glennparham.com. Hit me up on LinkedIn, whatever. But yeah.
What are some ongoing strategies to create that end-to-end encryption for language models? That seems very interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't even really keeping track of it until I think it was last year. Apple published some research. I think Apple's like done a great job with really considering privacy to be one of its core pillars. So they published that last year, some paper on how they could basically do end-to-end encryption with AI in their various data centers. And then we've seen Seoul National University, like a university in Korea. They've just published something the other day or a couple of months back where they were able to prove actually taking like base models like Llama and so forth and being able to constrain it in a certain way using, I think, like low-ranking adapters to basically enable end-to-end encryption. The problem is it's super compute intensive. So we're still they were only able to do it on the smallest Llama model, which like no one really wants to use. So I think we're probably like several years away from that, but it's one of the most exciting things I'm looking forward to because it's going to enable us to have assurances that when we're using LLMs, imagine you're using an LLM on a radio network like I did with Radio GPT and like a war zone, right? And you want to make sure that things are encrypted, not just on the radio network, but as it interfaces with like, if an AI agent is on that, it's all going to be predicated on that end-to-end encryption, So that's my take. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was super informative.
Of course.
Even as someone who works.
Yeah.
So my question is around training, because like you mentioned, so much of how this technology gets deployed is figuring out, okay, like how is it used on the battlefield with actual operators.
Yeah.
And there's such a big like knowledge gap among people who are maybe not so tech savvy, and I know like ChatGPT and it's meant to be user friendly.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it was it within your purview to kind of think about how to once you bring these tools, once you deploy these tools, how to incorporate training for the everyday military operator.
Yeah, it was interesting because to me using these chatbots felt so intuitive. So I kind of discounted like again across the whole DoD. I'm like, oh, everyone should be able to just like pick it up. But Nipper GPT, which I'm sure you're familiar with, we had a lot of partnerships with them, and very early on, like they got a lot of demand where they're like, hey, we have so many users, like it's crazy, but these people don't have technical backgrounds or like are frankly like don't know how to operate technology at all. And so what we were able to do with AFRL, the Air Force Research Lab, was create some different, like very basic training videos where we're like, hey, if you want to, what was one example? If you want to be able to ask a question about these like different DoD documents, here's how to upload the document, and then here's how to like ask, X, Y, and Z questions. Very like primitive stuff, but I was shocked by the demand for that because people were like, "Can I get that video? Like, this was so helpful. I showed it." So, especially, with the leadership who, I to be frank, I think like maybe the younger generations are more used to using these kind of things. But as you go up the chain of command, you have leadership who obviously did not grow up with this stuff. And so it's kind of interesting because it educated people, but also like, I think convinced a lot of like commanders and like senior level people that this was worth investing in or buying themselves for their own capability. But yeah, training is like, I think for the chief AI office of the Pentagon, that should be like one of the main roles is like figuring out what training makes sense across the DoD. Like as you know, in the DoD, we have a million different training things we have to do for like cybersecurity and like don't put top secret information into like whatever. And so there's a lot of discussion as to maybe there should be like one more training for, which I'm like, but for AI use. So yeah.
And sort of as a follow-up question to that, have you found it easier now that leadership is getting its hands on these tools more for the DoD? Is it still a hard sell for them that these tools need to be deployed? Because I know so much of the barrier to technology adoption in the DoD is just like cultural.
Yeah.
So what were sort of, can you just shine some light on some of the barriers that you faced and then maybe how what still exists?
I think I had a lot of instances of meeting with leadership and them not knowing anything about AI, and me having to kind of convince them and be like, hey, it's worth at least having your unit try it out or experiment with. I have one kind of funny story of I was deploying and doing LLM stuff, and we demonstrated something to General Kurilla, who's in charge of all of US CENTCOM, and he he asked me like, this is awesome, like how good is this AI? And I actually had no answer for him because I was like, I don't know, like there's no benchmark, going back to my underlying thesis. But these generals, they're so used to metrics like, oh sir, this AI performed, or this system got X% target on track, or track on, I don't know what the phrase is, but they're used to being able to interpret feasibility and performance with these statistics. And so when we don't have those benchmarks to point to, I think that was actually the biggest barrier for convincing leadership, because it's like all I can convey to them is that it's a great chatbot, but that means nothing to them if there's no like empirical evidence about like, oh, you do joint logistics, supply chain optimization, this LLM is going to perform X%. Like we have none of that. And that's really, with all AI in the past, when we talk about Maven, all these other projects that came before, we always have had those metrics, but now that we have unbounded LLMs, all of that's gone. And so we need to do, in my opinion, like that should be the top priority. If we're going to get leadership to buy in on this, they're going to need to see like the numbers back that up, sort of thing. So.
And I've just seen in my experience too, like the big thing that I was asking about is operational impact.
Yeah.
How does this actually change how you fight conflict or
Yeah.
improve the day-to-day experience for firefighters? But
Yeah.
It's hard to communicate that in the typical metrics that.
Yeah. The one metric I was able to point to would be like how much time it saved, which is good. Like if we use an LLM as an analyst, like X% faster, which is good, but it's still not the complete picture. Just because you do something faster doesn't mean it's better. It could be worse, right? So yeah, if anyone wants to start a startup in that space, like please do that. But cool. Hey, yeah.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm just sweating.
Given your past experience working at a startup, where I'm sure you have like unlimited freedom, and moving to the government where you have like bureaucracy,
Yeah.
boss and boss of boss, like how did you think about like operating there? Was that like one of the reasons why you wanted to leave that space? space potentially?
Yeah, I came from the startup, and then we were acquired, so I was under this parent company. Like I said, I had no kind of interest in going into government because all I thought about it was like, yeah, bureaucracy, red tape after red tape. I actually got to go into DoD through, it was called the Defense Digital Service. So there's this whole ecosystem of these, they're called digital service. Have you guys heard of Doge? Yeah, okay, people heard of it, interesting. So it's, so Doge now is called USDS, but before it was Doge, the D in USDS stood for digital service. And so over the past 10 years, this all kind of spun out. I'm going to bring this all back, I promise you. Over the past 10 years, there was, under the Obama administration, there's like healthcare.gov debacle, where they made a healthcare.gov website for like, after the Affordable Health Care Act, for everybody to go to and register and do whatever. And there was like this infamous story of the website. It was made for the whole country. Everyone was supposed to access it, but it was only made to scale to like six concurrent users. And so that's why it crashed. And I remember like a Saturday Night Live sketch about this. Anyways, so they since then spun off all of these like digital services. The idea being getting, good technical talent from the private sector, from startups, into the government at like decently senior levels. I was a GS-15, which I know means nothing in this space, but in the government civilian world, it means something. And so I was able to come in at that level where, because you're kind of at a senior position, you have much more flexibility and like autonomy. Also, we were reporting kind of directly to the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary of Defense, that the previous one, Secretary Austin. And so that kind of granted me a lot more latitude in terms of what I was able to do. Because like anytime I was getting into like over the past couple of years with Task Force Lima, anytime I was running into a roadblock or I caught the typical DoD like, oh, we'll get to you when I get to you, I could bust out the whole like, on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, like I'm here to, execute on his priorities. And then, wow, that response comes like so quick. But it was, I think over time, and part of the reason why I did leave a couple of weeks ago was that autonomy started to kind of be eroded away due to other political factors and so forth. But I really like fundamentally believe in digital services, because I would have never come to government had it not been for digital services. And unfortunately, we're going to see most of the digital services disappear in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, it's definitely a balance for sure. Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I found that one example of incorporating the DoD technology into the radio system really interesting.
Yeah.
But like, I guess my perspective of the current models is that they're quite like sycophantic. They often give really like false information.
Yeah.
And if you drill down on it, they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Like,
Yeah.
then they give you another false answer. So
Yeah.
I guess I just have like basically like very little trust in them.
That's
And so
totally
I'm
fair.
quite
Yeah.
skeptical, I guess, of incorporating it, and I wonder how you like thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which again, the point you bring up, I think goes back to benchmarks, us being unable to, in any shape, way, or form, evaluate like how it would perform against a radio network. But no, you bring up a really good point. Like, that's why, in our initial generative AI guidance across like the DoD, we were very clear that people should only be using these LLMs for very low stakes context. And so when we did things like Radio GPT, that's the name we gave it, these were for different training exercises, or they're trying out a number of different kind of like different types of technologies. But there's a big difference between doing something in a training exercise and experimenting with it and actually fielding it for like operational use in wartime. So I think like the biggest problem and why I think there needs to be more work done. I wrote a whole thing about like bringing LLMs to the U.S. government. Is I think we're in this like gap between experimentation and production or operational use, where we can have a little proof of concept, we can hack together some sort of thing at a hackathon. We can do radio GPT where it's like, oh cool, like it can listen to different radio conversations. But when it comes to actually getting what I mentioned before, the authorization to operate, that's like a huge, that's a big difference. And there's a much higher and like understandably higher kind of or lower risk tolerance there. So I think I totally agree with you. I think everything comes back to benchmarks. Benchmarks for like a radio network, for example, evaluating how models perform with radio chatter. Like that's just one benchmark that I think someone should develop. The problem is it's hard to build a lot of these benchmarks at scale. Although there's a whole company called Scale AI that does that, but it could be really expensive. But I think that's probably, in my opinion, the only way to really get at the root of the issue. So, yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'll go. Yeah.
Since no system is entirely unhackable, something like
Yeah.
NiperGPT, what cyber risks, what are some like realistic cyber risks that you're dealing with or foresee having to deal with?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So NiperGPT, it's going back to the different impact levels, it's authorized only for unclassified use. There have been, and NiperGPT is not unique in this regard. A lot of things, people want to build AI agents and all sorts of different things, or LLMs connect to different systems and whatnot. And so there's been a lot of work, even just by like the private sector, in doing red teaming of these LLMs to assure that they're not going to try to like run malicious code and things to that order. That's why we go to DEF CON every year, to kind of partially demonstrate that. There's starting to be more evaluation by more cybersecurity-centric parts of the national security world, like DoD and the intelligence community, that are focused on like exactly what you're talking about, which is, how do we make sure that if we do have an AI agent or an LLM-based AI agent, that it doesn't have a tendency, or we can evaluate its tendency to inject malicious code or do any number exfiltration. I mean, any of those, like there's a million different vulnerabilities. But I think generally speaking, when it came to our recommendations for authorizing, again, that authorization to operate, like that's the literally piece of paper that you can get from an authorizing official that says like, this is now authorized for use, was to apply the same cybersecurity guardrails that you would to any other application. But there was kind of a consensus, or there were kind of different schools of thought, where some people thought we should treat LLMs totally differently and give them access to different permissions. I'd largely disagree with that. I think we should treat them like any other, like most other web apps, in terms of how we deploy these web apps, what environments that they live in, the different like open source vulnerability scans that we have to do, all that kind of stuff. But like I mentioned, there's now a greater push across the national security community to do more like national security specific red teaming to prevent things from going haywire. And I see things on Twitter all the time where people are like, oh my God, these LLMs are gonna like, I don't know, get access to the nuclear codes or stuff like that, which I guess there's never say never, but yeah, I think that's what people are gonna be working on for the next couple of years. Sorry, and you had a question?
Oh, yeah, just, this is super light and random, but I remember you mentioned during your presentation very briefly that you worked on your deployment in a hurricane or something like that.
Dude, oh my God. Oh my, this was, can I say where it was? It was in Florida, so I guess that makes sense why there's a hurricane. Yeah, we were deploying something and the sirens were going off and we had to leave this place by a certain time. And we had to go, I have to be so vague, but we had to go and get access to this different network that wasn't in the space that we were currently in, but it was in a different building, like half a mile away, which doesn't sound like far, but it was a hurricane. Like literally the sirens were going off on the military base, like take cover. And so I took one for the team. And, and yeah, my shoes were totally destroyed, but we got that deployment up and running, and it was a really good, that was one of the few deployments that actually had really good operational impact. So I take a lot of pride in it, but yeah, my shoes are ruined. I never made it back to DC, so that's okay. I can live with that. But yeah, any other questions? If not, like, again, I will try to circulate this deck. Maybe I'll send it to you and you can just send it around. And feel free to hit me up whenever. Yeah.
Whose responsibility is it to create those benchmarks? Is it you?
That's y'all's responsibility, okay? That's you guys. I'm actually not joking. Like, we don't really have an effort, to be frank, of that work on the government side. We've looked to private industry. Private industry is more focused on higher level benchmarks because they care about, like, you know, the, what is it, 500 million users of ChatGPT and benchmarks for that. They don't really care about, you know, national security. It's like kind of trivial to them in the grand scheme of things. But you know, in terms of like what I'm working on next, I'll keep you guys posted, but like, actually no one is creating benchmarks, and it is totally on outside players to come do that. The problem is that most outside players don't have national security domain experience, right? So it's hard to create a test for the material you don't know, sort of thing. But I would just highly encourage you guys to really like think hard about benchmarks, which is so unsexy. Everyone wants me to say AI agents, but benchmarks are more important. I'm sorry. So let me know if you guys work on that. Yeah.
I have a question about NIPRGPT.
Yeah.
How do you make a AI that's comparable to, say, ChatGPT when the government has a very like limited data set in comparison to like, ChatGPT, for example?
So you know, NIPRGPT, and this kind of goes back to my earlier point about using open source models. It's heavily been able to leverage those over the past like 1 to 2 years, which has been huge because you're totally right. Had it not been for open source large language models, AI models, we would not have anything. Like, we literally would not have a single LLM over the past couple of years. And so that's been the majority of, even beyond it. There's other tools, one's called Camo GPT. I don't know if DIU funds Camo GPT, I'm not sure. But there are a bunch of different chatbots that exist, and they've all been leveraging open source. Now, it's going to be interesting, though, because now that OpenAI and Anthropic and Google, yes, now that they're expanding their national security presence, like their models are getting authorized for top secret workloads. Like, this is public information. They're authorized for top secret stuff now. You're going to see a lot of these tools start to integrate more of those models, which people love, right? Because they have more performant models, and we're starting to achieve greater parity with like ChatGPT. The most frustrating thing was, I would say back in like 2023, when DoD chatbots were emerging, and then people were using ChatGPT, the difference was so stark, right? Where you'd like use ChatGPT to generate stuff at home, and then you go on this like shitty, you know, DoD version, and it's like, oh my God, this is so unhelpful. But now, thanks to like a lot of hard work with the AI labs and everybody, things are kind of leveling off, where like what you guys have on chatgpt.com right now, we're probably like, you know, maybe 3 to 4 weeks out from like DoD being able to use that. So that's hard, and that's why I think for AGI to actually make its way into the department. It's all about those secure pipelines to be able to say, hey, let's say AGI comparable model was released today. We want to make sure that like the DoD can get access to it a couple of weeks down the line, instead of what's been the case the past few years, where it's like we're years behind of private industry, and that makes people really mad at me, and I get a lot of angry emails. Like, I'm sorry, but yeah, it's a good question. Cool. All right, thanks guys, I appreciate it. Yeah.